Okay, so thank you for joining us on this morning's webinar, PFI Handback, Act Now to Protect Your Investment, the first in a series of Freeths webinars jointly hosted by Grant Thornton and Thomson FM. Before I hand you over, if you've got any questions for the panellists, please use the Q&A function throughout, and these will be addressed at the end of the webinar. If you've got any technical issues throughout, please use the chat function and I can answer these. And I'll hand you over to Jackie. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tom. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar this morning. My name is Jackie Heath. I'm a partner at Freeths and I specialise in major projects. I'm here with the specialist, James Larmour, who's also a partner at Freeths and does capital projects as well, together with Rhiannon Williams, a director at Grant Thornton, together with Mark Whittaker, who's a consultant at Thomson FM. So if we can move then to the next slide. So this shows the number of active PFI transactions, together with details of their eventual expiry. In the next 10 years alone, and that's by 2030, there will be 180 projects which are going to basically come to an end. In the slide, you will see then that obviously the numbers have been going up and then they're going down. But by 2016 to 2017, it reaches a peak of PFI projects at just under 700 and then reduces in number. So the management of these contracts ahead of expiry will be a challenge for all the people involved, whether it's from the public sector, the private sector, but this will need careful planning involving technical, legal and financial input. Some of the matters for consideration will be addressed this morning by our panel members, prompted by a series of questions. So, first question, panel, where would you start if you were advising a client on the handback process?
I think with all these things, Jackie, preparation is going to be key, and you really need to get your house in order and understand what the contractual obligations are of the parties, and really you can't escape the fact you've got to do some document collation in order to get your arms around what the obligations of the parties are in relation to the handback process. So I think you really need to get a very clear view of the commercial position, and obviously the starting point for that is going to be the original transaction Bible. Now hopefully people have still got them, but I'm aware some people leave them down the back of the sofa or something, and even if you do have the Bible, there are issues with that as well. Say for instance, where are the technical documents? Now I've seen examples of people trying to rely on technical documents which are basically the PDFs which the lawyers have scanned in. Invariably they're not the best documents to work off, and some of them can be illegible. In addition to that, you've got a contract which has been around for say 20 to 30 years, and there will be a whole host of variations that will have been entered into during the lifetime of that project. So you do need to track down those variations and then understand how those might impact upon the handback process. And I think one of the kind of quite mundane but perhaps important tasks is if you've got a series of variations, particularly if they're quite complicated, it may be worth investing time trying to pull together a conformed copy of your project documentation, which gives you a single point of reference, because otherwise you could find yourself every time you pick up a PA, for instance, having to read across the original document plus a series of variations, and that is going to get very boring very quickly because you're going to have to start refreshing yourself every so often as to how the whole thing fits together. So yeah, that investing some time in that would clearly be of benefit. And the other thing, and I think Mark will pick up on this, is from experience, you do find when you dig into the detail of the technical schedules, sometimes there can be discrepancies between what the technical schedules say and what the front end of the legal docs say. So trying to reconcile those two and trying to reach a cohesive position is another challenge in trying to get a clear view of the contractual matrix.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, completely agree with that, James. I suppose from a technical point of view, in terms of the handback, the starting point is probably to blow the cobwebs off the project agreement and the facilities management agreement, and to go back to kind of the fundamentals and the basics of those and understanding those. Invariably, kind of information has been, during the course of the PFI, may have been passed on person to person, and sometimes it's kind of, it's like a Chinese whispers, that the end of what somebody understands is actually covered by that particular contract. It has no resemblance to what actually was there in the first place. Another, I suppose, important aspect from a technical point of view as well is have a look to see whether the actual is a specific handback schedule within the contract, because sometimes they will contain them, not all the time, but certainly sometimes there'll be a handback schedule that forms part of the contract. And also, I suppose, from a technical point of view, it's really important that like James was saying, in terms of getting a collation of the important documentation from a technical point of view, it's ensuring that kind of the asset registers are detailed and accurate and up to date. Forward maintenance plans are there. Access to accurate O&M manuals is also, from a technical point of view, really important. Compliance records is absolutely crucial. And also kind of drawings, room data sheets, accommodation schedules as well. All that suite of documentation got to be collated, and that's got to be the real kind of technical starting point, really, before you then start moving on. So that's that for me anyway, from a technical point of view. That's where you've got to start the whole process, really.
And something that we've certainly come across in a number of PFI schemes we've looked at is really getting an understanding of what the scope of the PFI is. There's often a perception from both parties as to what is in scope and what isn't in scope, and that's particularly the case when you retained buildings have been involved. So if it was a greenfield site development, then that should be really straightforward. But if the PFI was on retained estate, then it can often be much more complicated and may involve going back to all those documents that both Mark and James have talked about, going back to the original red line drawings, going back to the contracts, and really trying to establish what is included and what isn't. And in terms of blowing the cobwebs off things, it's also going back to the original financial model, or the financial model that posts any variations that have happened. It should be an escrow, but that depends on whether it was ultimately put into escrow and how early the scheme is. And really understanding what the financial model assumed, who the senior debt lender is. There's been an awful lot of change on many PFI projects around the financings. Lots of them have been refinanced. So understanding who the debt provider is, when it will be fully repaid, what the tail is, and when dividends actually start being paid towards the end of the concession.
So are there any other considerations that we need to be aware of?
I think from a kind of technical point of view, I suppose it's a really important that the whole kind of relationships and responsibilities and the parties involved is tracked and understood, because, you know, especially from an FM point of view, during the course of the PFI scheme, there is a possibility that certain elements of the scheme may have, the service delivery may have been sold, and that may be because the FM code decided that they needed to raise money, or, as in the case of Carillion, the FM code got into financial difficulties as such, and there was a need for other companies to take over on that one. So I think understanding that and which parties are responsible for what elements is really, again, is a key consideration to be established really quite early on. I think something that kind of James has mentioned as well is really key, is the fact that scheme from day one it has evolved. And certainly towards the end of the scheme, there's going to be a lot of variations and differences that's happened along the way, and it's really important to kind of understand those and track those, and again goes to this area of responsibility: who's responsible for what, and what's been agreed along that way, and to really kind of be able to track that and have a kind of a paper trail that's available for audit to show that that's what's happened and everybody's clear on terms of that. that ultimately, if you can get that right, will save time a lot in some of those kind of potential conflict or disputes further on that could delay the whole process and get bogged down in those. So that's really important to kind of establish those. And I suppose another aspect really important is the whole issue of how the payback is operated. Has it operated during the course of the concession, and if so, how long? How is it operated, and how have those penalty clauses been applied? Understanding those is a key part of it. And I suppose, Rhiannon, from a financial point of view, that's obviously really, really crucial in any kind of financial review and assistance, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think it's just essential to really understand how the services operate. How has the PFI scheme been operating? Have the levers in the contract been used? Has the payment mechanism been used? And what's the position of it? Are there any outstanding disputes? So I think really it's doing that upfront due diligence between the financial due diligence, the legal due diligence and technicals to really understand what has happened. And in addition, and this really does feed into the payment mechanism point, is going back to the reporting and whether there has been regular reporting. Probably horrify James in saying that, I think, but if regular reporting or regular and accurate reporting hasn't been taking place, then it should start as soon as possible.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I think reporting, particularly some of the more tucked away, should we say, obligations under a project agreement, might often get ignored in the day-to-day running of a project. So as you rightly say, Rhiannon, if you're not on top of that, then maybe it's time to start looking at it in earnest. Just to pick up on a couple of other points, Mark talked about kind of changes in responsibility. One thing to be aware of course, is that during the lifetime of the project, there's been transfers of responsibility for FM between various contractors, be that through a business acquisition or indeed where you have insolvent companies going back to Jarvis at the start of the decade to more recently Carillion. Now query how the responsibility for the FM service is delineated between those outgoing and incoming contractors, and how that then plays into responsibility for the overall condition of facilities when you get to handback. Another issue to be aware of is informal variations, and we've talked a fair amount today about collating all the information. There may be stuff which is blindingly obvious that you need to get hold of it, but we should also be aware that on the ground people may do things in a slightly more relaxed manner in terms of varying the contracts. And there may be things such as authority change notices, email correspondence, or even kind of informal working practices which have developed over time, all of which could impact upon how the handback process and the handback requirements operate. So you need to get an understanding and a feel for what all those might look like.
James, so what will happen to the facilities on expiry?
I think it's probably worthwhile having a quick refresher on how the standard handback provisions work. And in very simple terms, a survey is carried out around 24 months prior to expiry. If it's found that there's any works that need to be carried out because the facilities don't meet the handback standard, then the project company is required to carry out those works. And then during that 24-month period, there are amounts are withheld from the entry charge in order to fund, or rather provide security for performance of the rectification works. And then when you get to the expiry date, the facilities are handed over to the original procuring authority. But in all these things, it's really important to dust down your handback provisions and really understand how they work, particularly on older deals where there will be wide-ranging differences and nuances, but as compared to the standard provisions. And I think you can't just assume that the assets will revert to the public sector counterparty. So, for instance, in a number of older deals, the assets may remain with the PFI contractor, or indeed the PFI contractor may have an option to acquire those assets upon expiry. The other thing to think about perhaps is whether how residual value risk is treated. In many projects, for example, in lift, NHS lift, the assets can be purchased by the authority, but they'll have to make a residual value payment to the PFI company, and obviously how that will be funded is a question for the authority. So I think really it is important to get at an early stage understanding as to what your provisions look like, and don't just assume that you've got a nice straightforward SAP C4 handback provision.
Yeah, I think it's just so important to understand the process. I think the process might seem obvious, but as with everything in PFI, the devil's in the detail. And I think it's also the relationship and the triangulation between what is the legal process, what are the financial consequences of handback, and what needs to happen from a technical perspective. And all of those are related and really can't be viewed as separate work streams because there's such an interconnection between all of them.
I think that's right, Rhiannon, and actually that is perhaps one of the failings when people were putting these deals together originally, that there wasn't enough interface between technical work streams and legal work streams, which is why, if you've got the centre driving hard a standardisation message in terms of legal documentation, when perhaps the technical documentation by its very nature is less standardised, you can often find there are those glitches where the documentation doesn't marry up as it ought to.
Yeah, and just kind of picking up on a point that James made there, really, in terms of timescales, it is from our perspective, it's really important that those kind of surveys and life cycle reporting are not left too late, because absolutely right in terms of there's a process to be followed, and it's getting that accurate data together, reviewing it, discussing and agreeing what actions may need to be followed coming out of that, then implementing those and getting those done, and then for it then to be ready kind of for the handback. So sometimes the sooner you start, the better, really, just so it isn't rushed and you give yourself sufficient time to really kind of properly manage the whole process. And another point, just kind of reiterating from what James was saying, really, is depending on what the future use of the properties are going to be, but also an important kind of consideration for the authority, really, as well, is understanding as to how are they going to kind of deliver those facilities management services going forward. Are they going to kind of continue to outsource those, or are they going to decide actually we're going to take those services in-house, and with the implications of those? But also an important consideration as well is the fact of understanding what budgets they've got available to do it, because that model of delivery of those FM services going forward is going to be fundamentally different to the PFI model, and that responsibility for that life cycle of those assets is going to be really important. And what you don't want to be in a situation of the PFI having carefully managed the life cycle of the building and those assets over a period of time. It then goes to the authority for their responsibility, and they may not have that internal expertise, or fundamentally they may not have the budgets available to maintain it to the same standards or to keep on top of it. What you don't want to be in a situation, post handback, is that you've got a fast declining, deteriorating asset because it's not being maintained properly, or because there isn't the capital reserves there to be able to fund some of the replacement projects that needs to be done. So that's really important kind of consideration going forward, is looking beyond the handback as to what the future use of the building is and how it's going to be managed and maintained. It seems patently obvious, but there is a lot of detail that needs to be drilled in there, and understanding of budgets, because it's crucial, really, that the work that's been carried out over the PFI isn't suddenly the building deteriorates massively. It's really important to factor that into any of those considerations as well, I'd say, from a technical aspect, really.
Sorry, Rhiannon,
okay. I think in terms of the surveys, it's just important not to underestimate the time that these surveys take.
Yeah.
So certainly our experience recently is a survey of can take up, a full survey can take up to 40-50 weeks. The scope of that survey needs to be negotiated and agreed. If you think of 2025, 26, when there's, I think it went up to what, 698 schemes, it's difficult to imagine that there's going to be enough capacity in the market to do 698 surveys at any one time. Hopefully all those surveys won't be needed. But there will be considerable time needs to be factored in to do these. Sorry, James, you were.
That's all right. I was just going
to say
to
something.
No, it's just the flip side of what Mark was saying. There are some assets which may not be required by a procuring authority. We're aware that there are some schools which are kind of obsolete because of changes in demographics. Now, depending upon what the intended use of those assets is post expiry, but there is a question as to whether the authority should really start to think about de-scoping the service provision where it's got an asset which it doesn't have an ongoing use for. So can you, reduce the ongoing spend if it's something which you're going to sell into the market for redevelopment as housing or some such. So giving some thought to the future use is really quite important, I think.
Yeah, and just following on from the kind of the point made, kind of Rhiannon, when you were saying that there's going to be a strong demand for kind of asset surveys, you probably saw me smirking and smiling then in glee, because we kind of a lot of surveys and we'll continue to do so for quite a period of time, hopefully. I think the assumption as well, and a key consideration that we find when you're doing those surveys as well is not to treat in isolation, say, oh well, it's that level of gross internal floor areas for that building, so it should take 20 days and then you move on to the other. Factoring in the fact that we've got to have no impact whatsoever on the operational function of those buildings is really important as well, and whether it be a hospital, whether it be a school or other kind of buildings like that, it can take slightly longer when you've got to do things, for example, out of hours, and that's a key consideration. Access is a huge issue at the moment.
Yeah.
Obviously, with what's going on with the whole COVID situation and lockdown in certain areas as well, and so factoring in kind of the ability for surveyors to get in there to carry out that survey and to get all that data back is really important. And the other thing as well, I'd say from a quality point of view, is the fact that it is so essential to get that asset data and that survey data really, really spot on. So it is a false economy to do it on the cheap, because that, again, it feeds into this whole issue of what can prevent some of these problems at a later end that can cause conflict, dispute, delays, and not getting the right level of asset data, an accurate level of accuracy is really, really one of those kind of pitfalls you want to avoid. Get a really good job done, get that data, analyse it, and kind of feed that into the model so that then that can be then form part of those discussions. It's really, really important. But reiteration of those timescales, don't leave it too long before you start scheduling and kind of getting those organised. It's a long process and needs to be kind of considered for that. And going back to your point, Rhiannon, there is going to be a demand for these surveyors. So you might not be able to get them to do it fundamentally as quickly sometimes as you may want to, and that's got to be factored in as well.
We might need to retrain Rhiannon.
Okay.
So is it easy to establish what's in and out of handbag?
Yes and no. I think, as Rhiannon touched on, it's really important to understand the scope of the PFI. And if you just looked at, a brand new just signed project agreement, it should be reasonably straightforward to establish what's in and what's outside the scope. But you have to bear in mind that these documents will bear the scars of 20 plus years of variations. And you need to unpick this, try and understand what's in and what's out. And there's a number of things that could have happened over the lifetime or even at the inception of a project, which means you're going to have to spend some time trying to work out what the position is. So retained status, something Rhiannon's mentioned, that should be reasonably easy to establish from the project experience itself. But then there's a whole host of other things. So we often encounter post-completion construction works, either carried out by the procuring authority or sometimes carried out by the PFI contractor. And then the question is, who's responsible for maintenance of that asset, and to what standard? Is it going to be maintained by the procuring authority? Is it going to be subsumed into the PFI? Quite often when we see things which are subsumed into the PFI, in order to get lenders comfortable with that, those new facilities are very often ring-fenced and subject to a different payment mechanism and lower service standard. So what are the handback requirements in relation to those parts of the facilities as compared to the original PFI buildings? There could be disparities there. We've also seen a number of descoping variations over the years in order to drive cost savings. So the things such as general change in law risk being taken back by authorities, or removing services, or indeed relaxing service standards. Again, these are all things which could play into what the handback requirements are, or indeed what the assets are which are subject to the handback regime. We've also encountered a number of changes to the regime for furnitures, fixtures and equipment, very often with those items being taken back in-house by the authority, so those clearly would no longer be subject to handback. And then finally, you find on a kind of sector by sector basis very bespoke equipment arrangements. So in the mid-noughties, there was a real vogue for managed equipment services in the NHS. They will have a completely different handback regime. And then when you look at things such as ICT in schools, what are the handback requirements in relation to those? So I think there's an awful lot to look at on a project specific basis, and it just comes back to the original point of, what documents have we got, what changes have there been to the project, and then working all that through to establish exactly what it is you're dealing with.
And I think a key part of that, and we've come across it very recently, is some of these things might have been in dispute during the term of the project, and obviously at Handback they need to crystallise. So if there are disputes around equipment, whether what equipment should be replaced, the terms on which they should be replaced, ultimately agreement does need to be reached for both parties to be able to close out of the PFI scheme, and that can be really difficult. So the sooner that's addressed and the issues are put on the table and really understood, the better.
Yeah, and from kind of a technical aspect, really, and it's going back to the point that James was making before, I suppose, is the fact that a key part of it really is being guided from a technical aspect, is being guided by the contract documentation, and that should define what the split of responsibilities are. However, if the contract documentation is lacking in certain detail, then inevitably that could lead to kind of some potential for dispute, really. So that from a technical point of view is a clear kind of reference point. I suppose the other thing I'd mention as well is the fact that when talking about and looking at the handback strategy, I think it's really, really important that the SPV and the FM company are really aligned as soon as possible, really, in terms of their handback responsibilities, to make sure that those handback requirements are going to be met, and that key collaboration, working together, again, will be really, really crucial in making the handback a success, and not be kind of dragged down into too much dispute and delays, really. They've got to be kind of working.
I think Mark's frozen.
He has. And he's in the office.
Aligned to.
Okay.
You froze for a few minutes, Mark.
Oh, my apologies. I'm back.
Okay, no, thank you for that, Mark. So what condition will the assets need to be handed back in?
I suppose from technical point of view, the asset surveys will we'll give those ratings on the condition of them, and a lot of the time that will be based on the CIBSE guidance for the ratings. So the CIBSE conditions really is usually the benchmark, but as well as that, that needs to be kind of supported with clear evidence of the asset maintenance, of the replacement, and also the ability to last its residual kind of life at Handback. So there should, in theory, be kind of a history that's been built up over the project lifetime for the assets. Also, I suppose it's got to meet the core kind of construction design requirements, again, making reference to what's in the original contract, but it's really, really important that that will usually be defined in the project agreement and needs to be understood as well. So those, from a technical point of view, is really important. And I suppose the other important consideration when we're talking about what condition the assets need to be handed back in is that sometimes there's aesthetic appearance requirements as well sometimes. Now, not every time that's going to be stated, and it's not going to be for every asset, but there may well be a standard that's described within the contract that needs to be adhered to as well. So that really kind of needs to be considered, as well as, like I say, other things like availability criteria. And I suppose the important thing really, if you're using guidance like the CIBSE asset ratings and good quality surveys, it takes out some of that subjectivity and grey area, because there's always going to be some kind of element of what's fair wear and tear and what has been deterioration in an asset because it's not been maintained properly. But as long as those records has been kept up to date and can be referenced, but also the fact that you know, you've got a good survey that points towards what's been done, and hopefully some of those grey areas can be taken out, so there's less area of kind of dispute really.
I think, to my mind, this could be a potential minefield when you look at how the Handback provisions are drafted. And typically we see two approaches. The first one is what I'd call a specific Handback standard, and that's what you mostly see on NHS deals, where it's estate condition B, although I'm still at a loss as to what that means. The alternative is what I call a generic Handback standard, and this is a statement which is saying that you will hand back the facilities in a manner which is consistent with you having complied with your obligations under the project agreement. Now, that is obviously quite a bland and obvious statement, but I think underlying that seems to be a requirement to carry out a lot of analysis of what are the actual technical and legal requirements of the project agreement in terms of the facilities, and what does that look like when you translate them into the facilities themselves. And I think one of the points we alluded to earlier was the fact that you can't just go and appoint a surveyor and off we go. You've actually got to agree what they're surveying, what is the scope of the survey is, and what is the standard that the benchmark which they're applying to the facilities. And I can't help thinking it's going to be more than a 5-minute job to try and work out exactly what that scope is and what the benchmark is, not least because you've got to agree it between all the parties. So you've got to do the work, then you've got to agree it, then you've got to do the survey. So this really does strike me as a fair amount of work which needs to be done up front in advance of setting the surveyor off on their task, assuming you can find one to appoint, at least according to Rhiannon.
And I think James, there's a very real risk that both parties go into this with a lack of trust of the other side. So the private sector is likely to think that the public sector is going to be asking for gold taps and, you know, state of the art. And likewise, the public sector's at risk of going into it of thinking that they're not going to get what they want out of it and what they need. So I think trying to do it early, before, when there is enough time to make the changes that are needed to the extent that they are needed, and reach agreement as objectively as possible, both from all the perspectives of legal, technical and financial, Ultimately, the key issue around PFI exit is who bears what cost. And, you know, if both parties can go into it trying to take an objective point of view, and not anticipating what the outcome's going to be, I think that will be incredibly helpful.
Yeah, I certainly think a lack of time is the enemy of an amicable solution.
Totally.
So we've talked about surveys, and I think it's just what other detail needs to be looked at.
Well, it follows on from what James and Rhiannon just mentioned, and what we've mentioned before. Really, is the fact that although the contract, the agreement, project agreement, may well have time frames within it for the handback and for surveys potentially, there's absolutely no harm in starting early and being proactive about that. And you know, starting with getting all the documentation together is a key one. But it's like we mentioned before, really, it's giving yourself sufficient time to actually schedule the surveys, but also fundamentally then to action the points that are arising from those surveys, really. And you're not going to know that. You might be able to predict, but you're not going to be able to know that before the actual surveys are undertaken. So there is absolutely no harm, like I say, in doing that early, planning well in advance, get all the relevant documentation together, and then start kind of working diligently on all of that on those fronts, really, so that you don't, it's not kind of loaded towards the end of the handback period where you've got too much to do in too short a time frame, and there can be some kind of not a lot of time to resolve some of the potential disputes that may be arising, really.
Yeah, and I think the real sticking point is likely to be around life cycle and the state of the asset. And in terms of life cycle, I think the NAO review of PFI Handback concluded from their survey, it indicated that a huge number of respondents weren't aware of what the condition of their asset was. I think it was down at something like 33%. So taking the time to understand what are the annual plans, what is the work that needs to be done, you know, having those conversations between both parties would be hugely helpful, but also understanding probably the state of the project company as well, and their ability to make any rectification works that are needed, and beginning to look into those aspects.
I think time's crucial here as well. You know, you gave an example of a survey which is going to take the best part of a year, Rhiannon. Now,
yeah.
if you've got 2 years to do your survey and complete any rectification works and then hand it all back, you can see how you could rapidly run out of time. You know, if there's some work to be done, well, you've got to agree what work needs to be done. You then need to carry out the works. Now, as Mark's mentioned, access is an issue.
Absolutely.
And if there's a reasonable amount of work to be done, you can quickly see how that time will soon ebb away.
Mm.
So, I mean, thank you for all that, which is really informative. I think just going through then, well, going forward, we've looked at the handback process. So what happens next?
So I think one of the most important things for both parties to do is once you've undertaken some due diligence, understand the process, the legal process and the technical process, is really look at the options. Certainly from a public sector perspective, is what options have you got, and going through the process, you know, where you can use a kind of a decision tree approach of working out what is the best option for you in terms of taking it forward, understanding the capital and revenue consequences of it, because if there are capital consequences of it, for example, if there is residual value, then more than likely you are going to have to do a business case. That goes back to the time aspect again. And we all know how long a business case process can take. That's going to add more time in. And so really understanding the process, the business case process, understanding what your options are and evaluating which you believe is your preferred option. And I think from the private sector's and investors' point of view, it's doing the same. It's really understanding what are the likely outcomes, what are the possible outcomes, and what is your preferred option. I think all of those, it's just essential to go through that process.
Yeah, and I suppose from a kind of facilities management point of view, there's a whole host of different considerations that will form part of kind of understanding the handback strategy and what happens post handback. And I suppose some of those key areas really are for public sector organisations to understand as to whether they want to bring those FM services in-house. So, de-risk almost by having those as a service in-house. Important consideration in doing that obviously is eligibility for employees to transfer over under cheaper regulations and the implications of that, particularly on pensions and things like that. So those are important considerations for doing that as to whether you insource or outsource. Again, we keep banging on about timescales and not leaving it too late, but a really, really important thing to consider in the whole procurement exercise is the timescales that's going to be involved in that. But also kind of internal resources available to do that. Have you got a procurement team available that has experience and expertise in being able to procure such contracts, or do you need a specialist technical consultancy, like Thomson FM, for example? Couldn't get away with that. But potentially the organisation will need to have that. So it's that procurement resource, it's also legal resource as well, potentially, that they're going to need to help them through that procurement journey. We've got kind of 43 minutes into this conversation, and I'm really sorry to bring up the word Brexit, but I'm going to have to do it in terms of procurement, because although at this moment in time those FM contracts may be governed by EU procurement, who knows what kind of post-Brexit will look like in terms of those procurement rules, but they'll probably follow a similar format in as much as needing to evidence fairness and value for money and the like. So there'll be certain criteria that will need to be done and met, and that undoubtedly will take time. So that needs to be kind of factored into it. Getting all that information together before you go to market is really, really important. You can't do it on the kind of 11th hour to decide to go and procure. That's going to be done well in advance, and you're going to need accurate information to be able to procure those services and get accurate tender responses and financial responses back commercially. And I suppose the important consideration as well from a technical point of view is what commercial model are you going to use for those
absolutely
those assets post handback. It all again goes back to kind of the de-risking element. So are you going to want to procure a new FM contract, which will be completely different to PFI? I mentioned it earlier in the conversation, but it is going to be a completely different FM contract than was the case in the PFI contract. But what are you going to do with life cycle? Are you going to try and include life cycle responsibility within the new FM contract? And if so, are the FM codes going to be wanting to take on that responsibility? There'll be some FM codes that will be very risk averse to doing that, because they won't necessarily be aware or have sight or understanding as to how well those assets have been maintained. So you don't want a situation where either there isn't an interest in taking on that life cycle responsibility from the market. So soft market testing may be an option to gauge that. But if they do want to do it, what you don't want to be in a situation then is you procure it, and then the FM co starts kind of doing their own asset surveys and delapping and excluding certain assets to say, well, it's not been properly maintained, we can evidence this. And it can get...
You'd hope the condition survey would be a good baseline for that.
You'd certainly hope so, if that can be agreed by all parties. But I think it's just an important consideration for the FM co, whether they're prepared to do that. If they decide actually we want a more kind of traditional kind of contracting model, and that the authority will take on the life cycle responsibility. Again, like I mentioned before, really, does the authority have the internal expertise to manage that effectively?
Well, if there's any ongoing dispute about the state of the building, then trying to transfer life cycle risk,
Absolutely.
you know, it isn't going to happen. So there's something about the timing and looking at the plan to exit and what needs to happen when. So if you would like to get life cycle transferred, risk transferred, then reaching agreement about the state of the building is going to be essential, isn't it?
It is, and it's again, it's this pitfall. You never want to be in a situation of finally agreeing what the handback, everything's been kind of done and dusted for that, but you've had to delay the procurement of the contract going forward, and there'd be nothing worse than having to kind of delay or have.
It's just a complete nightmare, isn't it? Because then you're left with this huge interregnum, and you know who's going to be responsible for managing the facility between the expiry of your PFI and the incoming contractor. And if I were a procuring authority, I wouldn't want to be going cap in hand to my PFI contractor asking for an extension. But of course, you know, there's also procurement issues tied up with as to whether you can extend a PFI contract. I know some older deals have a right to extend, but you know, again, on what terms, and you know, as ever with procurement law, it's never black and white. So that's going to create an issue in and of itself as to whether you can exercise an extension.
Yeah, something I just wanted to add in terms of is the importance of the continuity of service, which I know, Mark, you've just touched on that. But there's lots of anecdotal examples when Carillion fell over, you know, almost, well, 2 years ago. And I do a lot with the NHS, and a number of NHS trusts found themselves in a position where they were faced with possibly not having any of the soft FM services being provided, which, as you can imagine, that would make the hospital incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to run. You know, vans being packed up and vans being driven off site. So I think I certainly know from an NHSEI perspective that's a huge concern of theirs. And I'm sure that there's an awful lot. I know that there's a lot of NHS trusts that still have the provisional arrangements that they rushed into place, still in place now. So it's, again, you know, these things are difficult to put in place and then difficult, time consuming to change. So giving yourself the best opportunity to get the best outcome, I think, really comes back to the time point of planning and making decisions early.
Yeah, and I suppose another key element as well in terms of that whole process is stakeholder engagements as well. And one organisation want to make sure that, you know, that there is buy-in from all those that are actually fundamentally involved in the physical operation of these buildings, and designing a service going forward and that meets those. As I say, moving away from any assumptions and previous models. This is a new way of operating the new FM contract, for example, and there may be some improvements that can be made in terms of the delivery, but what the worst case scenario would be is the fact that a new contract's procured and then suddenly it's handed over to the people that are going to be operating the buildings to say, here you go, and they say, well, that really isn't what we wanted because it doesn't do this, this and this, and then you're kind of on the back foot, and they're inheriting a contract really that really they're not happy about, and doesn't meet their need. So stakeholder engagement is really, really crucial as part of that process of understanding what the strategy post the handback's going to be, and that takes time, again, because it's people have got the day jobs to do, but you need to be able to collate that information, understand it, and then kind of develop a model of delivery that's going to meet that, and keeping them engaged throughout that process, really, so that is that kind of smooth, almost like that soft landings approach, where it's kind of, it can be a smooth transition to the next contract, and that's so crucial, really, because there's a whole issue of credibility involved in that as well.
So finally then, I suppose if there's anything which you'd like people to take away today, what are the key messages from each of you?
Who wants to go first?
No,
you can.
Okay.
Okay, you go first, Mark.
Okay, thank you. I suppose from the technical aspect, and I hope the conversation today has probably given an indication of this, is that there is definitely an overlap between financial, between legal, and between technical in the way that the handback is going to be managed. And I think that there's a need for collaboration on all three of those fronts, because there is definite overlap in terms of some of the work that's going to be undertaken. So close working in that aspect is really, really important, I would say. I think developing the second point I would make is that developing a life cycle modelling now is really, really important to identify risks and understanding what needs to be done before handback. And also, I suppose, to make it run as smoothly as possible, it's really important that this collaboration piece between the Authority of Trust, the SPV, and also the FM code, that they all sit down and agree what the handback strategy is going to be and what the areas of responsibility are going to be. What you don't want is for people to be assuming certain things or working in completely different ways that potentially aren't aligned, and then again it can cause delay, conflict in the future, really. So those, from a technical point of view, I would say three important considerations going forward, I would say.
I think I'd focus on the planning and starting early. So I think IPA recommends between 5 and 7 years before expiry. I don't think you can start early enough. So put your exit plan into place, both on the private sector side and the public sector side. Really think through those issues that we've talked about, the due diligence, the understanding the contract, understanding how it's been managed, understanding your options. And I think as part of this, for those of us who've been involved in PFI for longer than we definitely care to remember, I think it's in everybody's interest to try and get a good outcome from this, because I think PFI has delivered some great buildings, has transformed local services, and it would be a real shame if, because PFI Handback was poorly managed, that we come out of this with PFI having a bad name.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think I'd echo that. I mean, over the years, a lot of water has flown under the PFI bridge, and I think it's very easy to forget that you know, in the early days, it's all about partnership and collaboration. And I don't want to get too misty-eyed about it, but at the time, people thought that, you know, they're actually doing some good and trying to improve the delivery of public services, particularly when you think back as to the condition of some of the facilities that were around in the late 90s. So, I mean, I think it really is time to kind of try and rediscover that spirit of partnership and collaboration, because I think that's going to get the best outcome for everybody. And there's the NEO report, which I may have ridiculed a little bit for pointing out the obvious, there is plenty of scope for disputes here, and I really think that is not going to serve anybody's interests if we end up in a massive slanging match between the public and private sector.
I mean, thank you. So, crikey, a lot's been said today, and thank you all for that. There are, I'm just looking at the question and answers, there are a lot of questions. So, so thank you, to the audience for being so interactive. I'm mindful that we've got 5 minutes left, so I think if we can make a start on some of the questions, and then to the extent we aren't able to deal with some of the questions, what we can do is pick up those directly afterwards. So, starting point then. And I'm just looking for the best question to ask, to be honest. What are the key risks around handbag?
Again, it's probably a reiteration of what we talked about. I would probably say some of the risks that could potentially be there is running out of time. It's the obvious one. We've talked about it throughout. It's that need to start early. So I would say kind of running out of time is one of the major risks if it's not properly project managed and planned in advance, and having kind of to work on that aspect. Other risks are conflicts. You're going to get situations where the authority, the SPV, the FM code don't necessarily get on well together, and some of those differences that may well be historical and have gone on for a considerable amount of time for the good of everyone have to be parked and some way forward. And whether that needs kind of independent help to do that, that may be the case where there isn't that kind of historical kind of animosity or argument as such. But I think that needs to be overcome, because if conflict isn't overcome, then that potentially can cause some problems and delays. And I suppose, again, major risk, the third one, final one for me, I suppose, is, which is what I mentioned to before, is can't stress enough how important it is to procure the contracts well going forward post handback, because like Rhiannon said, if you do something short term or you do something that is not fit for purpose, you could be having to deal with the implications of that for a considerable amount of time and paying financially for that for a considerable period of time as well. So if you've got the opportunity to start planning and doing it right early, it just, to me, it's a no-brainer. Get it started early, start planning and understanding how you're going to go about procuring those services, what they're going to look like, and how they're going to be delivered. And it will just save so much pain post-handback if that can be done now rather than kind of leaving it too late, really. So those are my three, I suppose, key risks.
I think this comes back to some of the points we ended on. You know, the public sector's got an obligation to demonstrate value for money. And the worst case scenario is that the asset gets handed back in poor condition, and that doesn't serve anybody on either the public sector or the private sector well. So the biggest risk is that the whole purpose and objective of PFI falls over on PFI exit.
I think from my perspective, for the public sector, quite simply, the biggest risk is not getting back an asset in the condition it should have been in. I'd say for the private sector, there's the risk, obviously, of claims if the asset doesn't meet that condition. But also conversely, I think if I were an investor, I want to be able to hand back the keys and distribute the remaining funds and not be embroiled in a dispute which is going to prevent me from investing in other schemes or chew up a huge amount of management time, because that is not where you want to be.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
I suppose the reverse then, what opportunities may arise in connection with PFI?
I think, there's the opportunity to vindicate the model and say, look, it did work, it was expensive, despite everyone's told you, but you've got an asset just handed back, which is in great condition. The other thing to look at is how you can reuse those assets and get most value from them. So, for example, street lighting, for instance, can you use those assets for in connection with the EV charging? They've got a power source, so you can do that. Can you look at, can you use those assets in relation to 5G? All these types of things. Can we be more agile and innovative in terms of how we use the assets which are coming back to the public sector?
Yeah, I think it's likely to define what happens in future and the relationships, the models that fall out in future between the public and private sector. It's such a shame that there isn't a better relationship between and much more collaboration. And if PFI exit generally goes well, on balance, they're not all going to go well, but if on balance they go well, I think that there'll be far more enthusiasm and drive for having similar models in the future.
Yeah, I suppose the final point for me would be the fact that the re-procurement of the FM contract doesn't necessarily need to be viewed as a negative and a difficult hoop to jump through. It could be a really positive means to drive some efficiencies, innovation, better value for money. As a result of that, the contract going forward, really, it is an opportunity. It's not, although it's a hurdle to overcome, it can deliver some really good things, I would say, as well.
So I'm mindful it's 11 o'clock. I'll deal with one more question and then we'll deal with the others afterwards. Apologies for that. So the question is we don't have a particularly good relationship with our partner. So how do we deal with Handbag?
You asked that one.
I'll jump into that one. I suppose,
Go ahead, Mark. Go ahead.
sorry, it's kind of going back to what I mentioned a couple of answers ago, really. It's the fact that you might need some third-party arbitration to help overcome some of those, because some of those may be kind of historical and quite kind of entrenched, and you just need to find a way through, really. Offering an olive branch might not be necessarily the only thing to do, but certainly I would suggest that maybe some kind of independent assistance might help resolve some of those issues.
I think it's also for both sides to do as much of the homework, the analysis that we've already talked about, so that at least they can come to the table with both perspectives and understand on each point how far apart they are. You know, I think both sides should have a desire to do that. I would hope they have a desire to do that. And I think if that can be done, then there might be some points where agreement can be reached, and at least it's easier to understand, you know, at the different points binary, in which case it's going to be very difficult to reach agreement without some sort of independent mediation, or if actually you're closer than you realise, it's simply that you've got a poor relationship.
I think from my perspective, the parties just got to realise that there's a lot to be done here, and if every day is going to be a battle, it's going to be very tiring and very, very hard work. And I do think that in many respects, you think about the amount of planning and resource that goes into putting these projects together, actually planning the exit from the projects and what's happening to them next requires a similar amount of resource and effort from the parties. And I think, you know, if you tried to close some of these deals, you know, years ago when everyone was just trying to have a massive fight, that would have been very hard going. So I think, you know, it comes back to collaboration, because as I say, if it's not done in a collaborative fashion, I think it's going to be very difficult to reach a positive outcome for the parties.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. So we're running slightly over, but I mean, you know, thank you to the panellists, and thank you for the people who've you know, joined the call today, and hopefully, you know, people can take away something new, and you know, and something that's helpful, you know, going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.